Hi, my name is Ashley Pantek, and together with Roger Corio, we researched the topic, should curriculum be standardized for all? Throughout the presentation, we will start with an opening activity. We will move on to some definitions, the key questions, the history of standardization in public schools, the pro side, the con side, the implications for the future, and our closing. To begin, we'd like to start off with an activity to get you thinking about some of the topics we will be discussing throughout our presentation. For this activity, you will need to think about two different phrases and create a concept map for each. First, we'd like you to think without your teacher hat on, and then with it. So first, we'd like you to think about the phrase Common Core. Write down any phrases or ideas you think of, and as you create connections between these ideas, box them. Now think about what Common Core means to you as a teacher or someone preparing to be one. Circle the words you come up with. You might want to pause here for a minute to give you time to think and to write these down. Now you will create a second concept map, thinking of the phrase student choice. What does student choice mean to you? As you write down these ideas, box any connections you make. Now, with your teacher hat on, think about that phrase again and circle the words you come up with. Again, you might want to pause for a minute just to think. These are two really common terms that are used in teaching, particularly if you teach math or ELA. So I want you to think about how you view these phrases. Is it positive? Is it negative? Maybe a little bit of both. And what influenced the words that were added with your teacher hat on? Did you think about your own classroom, how you plan activities in your classroom or plan lessons? And how are students impacted by these concepts? Does it affect the way you teach or how you provide instruction to them? Now I'd like to review a few terms that I think are important for this presentation. First, we have the word standards, which are the written descriptions of what students are expected to know and be able to do at a specific stage of their education. And then we have curriculum, which are the lessons and academic content taught in a school or in a specific course or program. These terms can sometimes be confusing, and many people use them interchangeably, even within the educational system. And they're really not interchangeable because standards tell us what students need to be able to know, what they are expected to do at a certain time. But the curriculum is how you are expected to get there. They tell you how to teach, whereas standards are just telling you what you should teach without much guidance on how to get there. So I think it's important as educators that we're able to differentiate those and not use them interchangeably like so many people do. The next term is CCSS, or Common Core State Standards, which are a set of high quality academic standards in math and ELA. These standards were originally adopted by 41 states, the District of Columbia, 4 territories, and the Department of Defense Education Activity. And it's important to note that these standards are not a curriculum, as they do not tell teachers how to teach material, but they explain what students should know and be able to do. The goal is to provide a consistent education to all students across the nation. And I think that that's a common misconception that Common Core State Standards were telling people how to teach. Next, we will look at some of the key questions that you can think about as you're listening to this presentation. So the first key question is equality or freedom more important in education? What role should education and schools have in the development of citizens in a democratic society? And how much choice should we give students in choosing what they learn? Now we'll move on to the history of standardization in public schools. Standardization has been a topic of discussion since the very onset of schools in America. But in 1882, the National Education Association began fighting for a standardized curriculum for high school graduation, or just high school curriculum. And by the early 20th century, many education organizations across the nation were using vague common standards for high school accreditation. Throughout the 20th century, teachers and policymakers worked together to create policies to provide equal educational opportunities for all students. These policies were created to end racial segregation, to support English learners, and to provide accommodations for students with disabilities. In the 1960s, the government created Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, and the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. ESEA was passed to help public schools provide educational opportunities to children in low-income families, but it did not allow the government to direct the curriculum in any way. NAEP was first used in 1969 to assess the condition and progress of schools in the United States. It tested 9-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 17-year-olds. And by 1990, NAEP was used as a guide for what children should be able to do, and it's still used today. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan's administration's National Commission on Excellence in Education published a report called A Nation at Risk. This report pointed out the low expectations and poor academic standards in school. The report also issued a call for equality of educational outcomes across racial and class lines. The authors demanded more rigorous content, higher expectations, more time spent in class on learning, and better skilled and trained teachers. Before this report was published, cheerleading and bachelor living were often counted as credits for high school graduation and were seen as just as important as the core subjects such as biology, chemistry, algebra. And many states only had one requirement for graduation, and that was physical education. So because of this report, by the 1990s, states began creating their own standards for education. No Child Left Behind Act was passed by Congress in 2001, and this was to close the achievement gap between low-income and minority students and their more advantaged peers. In 2010, the Common Core state standards were passed. By 2015, 41 states adopted these standards. And as I stated earlier, its goal was to provide a consistent education to all students across the nation.
Now to get into the arguments. First, the pro side, or yes for standardized curriculum. In our issue, this came from Mortimer Adler in The Padea Proposal, Rediscovering the Essence of Education, and that was written in 1982. A quote to summarize his idea: democracy is best served by a public school system that establishes uniform curricular objectives for all students, hence the standardized curriculum. So what ideas does he present throughout his argument? All children should receive the same education, whether they are college-bound or not, and all schools should have the same 3 objectives. Provide all children with opportunities for personal development. Schools should prepare students to be good citizens, and schools should prepare students to earn a living. Schools should also have a general and liberal curriculum. So that would be one singular curriculum with no electives except for a language. And if you think about the history of standardization that Ashley took you through, with things like bachelor living counting towards graduation, you can see how that might be included here. And as he notes, we are intentionally removing some of those specializations and extracurriculars as part of the high school experience there. He also says that students should experience 3 modes of learning, that is the acquiring of knowledge, the development of skills, and enlarging the understanding of ideas. And he breaks that down into 3 columns and says that all students should be experiencing these 3 types of learning in all of their classes. Additionally, he notes all students should learn physical training, personal hygiene, basic manual skills, and they should receive an introduction to the workforce. After high school, he mentions that there would be 3 levels of college available in varying forms depending on what the student is pursuing after high school. So what was Adler's goal? Well, he says the goal is to remove the barbarism of specialization. He wants to increase the general education of all citizens, stating we need more specialists who are also generalists. And in the end, his goal states that he wants to create a more successful society. Those who are not schooled to enjoy society can only despoil its institutions and corrupt themselves. So what Adler is saying is that in order for students to become successful citizens, we need to increase their general knowledge so they can be more well-versed in a variety of fields instead of just in one field. So for an example of this, if you can click on this video link and it takes you to a Socratic seminar, sort of what you would see in the 3rd mode of learning, expanding the ideas. So you see the students in discussion and thinking. And as you watch, you'll notice that the teachers and adults there note working on the students' ability for civil discourse. So again, thinking about good citizens, right? Educated, respectful conversation. And then at the very end, you can note that it's mentioned, right? Learning to think is a skill for everyone. So again, that universal standardization playing out in the video. Our con argument, so no for standardized curriculum. This comes from John Holt, and the excerpt is from Escape from Childhood, and then this one is from 1974. A quote to help summarize, imposed curriculum damages the individual and usurps the basic human right to select one's own path of development. So what is Holt saying throughout this excerpt? Children should have the right to control and direct their own learning. And this included what they learn, when, where, how much, how fast, and with what help. He says that the requirement for a child to go to school is a violation of civil liberties. So he points to saying that children should be the ones directing their learning. Parents would have less say, but not no say. But most of this burden on deciding all of what's listed above would be on the child. He also mentions that he feels that schools are not a safe place of learning, that schools are particularly anti-democratic, and everyone, including children, should have the right to say no to schools. So what is Holt's goal? Well, as he mentions, he's trying to preserve the right to determine what goes into our minds. He's trying to increase children's choice in their learning, let them learn what they want to learn, and then preserving our right to say no to being in school. And again, here's a short video where Holt talks just a little bit more of an explanation on his views about school and the effects that they have on students. So what are the implications for the future? Well, without some type of standardization, there's no valid way to measure the education of students from across the nation. If we want to follow the progress, there has to be some sort of standard way of doing that. However, going to the other side, using a standardized curriculum where everybody does the same thing does not leave a lot of room for individual needs of our diverse learners. So what do those implications look like today? And this ties back to the key questions from the beginning here. If we look at our first key question, what role should education in schools have in the development of citizens in a democratic society? Adler mentions this as one of his his goals in his standardized curriculum, what is the closest thing we have today? That would be Common Core. Think back to your opening activity and the things that you jotted down, maybe bring those back in. Just an additional reminder, Common Core is standardized standards, not standardized curriculum, but it is the closest representation of that idea that we have going on right now. So Common Core are national standards in math and ELA. They were implemented in 2010, and this focused mostly on skills, not the curriculum. That doesn't mean that there aren't suggested methods and literature that should be used, but that is left up to either the states or to the individual teacher. Nonetheless, it is similar to Adler that these standards are supposed to help prepare students for either college or a career. Well, so how standardized is Common Core? The national government does not have the power to implement national standards. That is a power left to the states. So if you're talking about in terms of federalism and the split up of power between national and state government, education is left to the states. So that means that the national government can influence but not require what states do in terms of education. At this moment, 38 states and Washington, D.C. have a version of Common Core. 4 states have never adopted Common Core, and 7 have revoked the standards, including Florida revoking it this year, and 1 state currently still has Common Core under review. So is it 100% standardized? No. But is there a version of this going on in a majority of states? Yes. And then what are the results? Because we've had just over a decade of Common Core. Results are fairly inconclusive. Data can be skewed to show pretty much whatever we want. Test scores have declined, but the new tests with Common Core are more difficult. If you look at the 2 charts to your right, these are from the NAEP standards, which are not connected to Common Core. They did not change, but the data in both of those is from math. And the top one, right, looks like a significant drop, where the bottom looks like a steady decline, but that is from the same data. So the results of this increased standardization, at least at the moment, is inconclusive. On the other side, if we talk about Holt wanting to increase student choice, a buzzword that I know floats around my school quite a bit is giving student choice. Are you giving students choice in the classroom? Are you giving them choices in the way they're learning? Even actually right down to discipline, right? Giving them choices that you're comfortable with, right? Lots about giving student choice. And that's the question that Holt is asking. So if we tie back to our second key question, how much choice should we give students in choosing what they learn? So what is student choice supposed to do? It's supposed to increase engagement in classroom. It's supposed to create increased ownership of learning, and it's supposed to empower students to make choices in their learning. So if you think about that progressive idea of students having some choice, and that would be increasing their ownership and their engagement because they'll be more interested. Students will do better on what they're interested in. Some data, and you can look at these in much greater detail if you scroll down into our narrative bibliography, if you would like to look into these studies in more detail, but just some data backing student choice from a 4-year study on reading choice over a 4-year period. Among other things, this shift, the shift being to student choice in reading, consistently resulted for the students in increased reading volume, a reduction in students failing the state test, and changes in peer relationships, self-regulation, and concepts of self. Additional data, Miller and Anderson concluded that this change enhanced student motivation to read. Also, they noted that on a yearly end of grade level test, students with reading choice scored higher than average on comprehension assessments as compared with district and state peers who did not experience choice. So there is some data backing the idea of increasing student choice in the classroom. Well, what would the implementation of student choice look like? Oftentimes, this is left to the teacher, so it's going to vary quite a bit. But that can be reading choices, like mentioned in the data. That could be multiple options to complete an assignment. It can be as simple as classroom jobs, and it can also be creating their own learning goals, right? Again, taking ownership in their learning. It can also mean state-implemented student choice. So, for example, there is a student-led civics project, which is now required in Massachusetts, and that is student-led, and that is very prominently stated within the guidelines of the expectations for that student-led project. And there's a link here to that guidebook if you so care to peruse it. But it is very clear that the students discuss and vote on the project topic, and it's the students that take ownership, and they're the ones leading this project as they complete it. So again, we have now in this case, a government institution, right? The state education department implementing and pushing this idea of student choice in this project. So to wrap all that up, we have one key question that we haven't addressed here, and that is equality or freedom more important in education? So if we think about the two arguments that were presented, one is arguing for equality. Everybody's getting the same exact thing, 100% equal, and that is what's going to make us successful. The other is pushing for increased freedom in education, right? The student has all of these options, choices, and gets to make those decisions. Increased freedom is what's going to make schools more successful. So as you're wrapping up here, and this is one of the things we're expected to do as educators anyway, is reflection. There's just a few things to think about at the end here. If you're somebody that likes to journal, now's a great time to maybe pull that out and write down your thoughts. But think about, where do you stand in terms of equality versus freedom? Are you more towards everybody needs the same thing, or is increased freedom going to be the way that we get to our end goal of teaching and educating students? From there, how do these values reflect on your classroom or your future classroom? What are the limits to total standardization or total freedom? So if we go 100% towards Adler and everything is 100% standardized, what are the limitations there? But then what would be the limitations of going Holt's direction and going 100% freedom? And then tying it back to the opening activity and some of our implications and the data, how have Common Core and student choice impacted your lesson planning and teaching? Because these are both things that pop up on a regular basis, and being in Massachusetts, which has Common Core, that's going to be impacting your lesson planning and what you are doing in your classroom. So at this point, Ash and I would just like to say thank you for watching, listening, and following along to this portion of the presentation. We do encourage you to watch the videos. They're only about 3.5 minutes long, and they do add just an extra bit to the arguments that are being presented. Additionally, the links are all active in the outline to play around with any of the data that's been mentioned, particularly the NAEP data. There's data for all 50 states, and you can see how those trends play out in states that have implemented Common Core and haven't implemented Common Core. If you really dive into it, it looks like most of the states that did not implement Common Core also followed that same trend of a decline on that nationalized standardized test. So just an extra piece there. But we look forward to seeing your comments in the discussion board. And again, thank you.